data center, and I tag this with 2014 because the concept of the software-defined data center has been around for quite some time, but it continuously evolves. And what we're going to be talking about today in our presentation is a little bit about how this is evolving and how we're changing to keep up with the constant demands on IT and IT operations. Right. So hopefully I keep power throughout the whole thing. I'm located in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're experiencing a little bit of the East Coast winter storms, but hasn't been a problem the past couple days or the past couple storms. So fingers crossed we'll stay up. All right, so on our agenda today, we're going to briefly cover kind of the concept, the idea of the software-defined data center. And then we're going to break that up into individual pieces and how this is evolving. VMware network virtualization with NSX. We're also going to talk about VMware Virtual SAN. And I do note that this product is still in beta. However, you have access to it while it's in beta. So it's a great time to test it out and get going. And I'll get into that a little more in detail when we get to Virtual SAN. And the last topic we're going to cover is VMware vCloud Automation Center and how that's going to help us moving forward when we have this software-defined data center in place. So a little bit of a virtualization overview before we get started. Kind of assuming that you're at least comfortable with the concept that this is where our hardware layer is, that's where our physical hardware is, right? That's where our servers are. And the virtualization layer is where our virtual machines are. So building on those topics, we have the cloud layer above there, which gives us infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So those three services combined give us that cloud layer, and this layered approach is going to be a recurring theme throughout this. So traditional compute virtualization, this is what has been around for a few years now. We're all probably fairly familiar with it. And when everybody thinks about virtualization, this is kind of what they go to, is the idea that we have our physical hardware, and basically on top of our physical hardware, we're going to be running a virtual machine layer, right? We're going to accomplish that by installing a hypervisor, and then we're able to propagate our virtual machines into our environment and configure and manage those virtual machines on this layer above our physical hardware. So what does compute virtualization do for us? Well, one of the big reasons that a lot of people move to it is consolidation, right? Rather than have these large servers, as server technology advanced and processors became faster and we're able to throw more RAM into our servers, we want to be able to use it all, right? There's no sense in having this big shiny new server and it's limited by, you know, an application that ends up only running single core support, and it's using maybe 10% of the CPU on an average basis. So the idea is use more of that horsepower that we have available to us, use more of the RAM that we have available to us, and kind of get what we paid for out of that hardware, right? Another good reason for consolidation is shrinking down the physical size of our data centers, because that saves money in power, that saves money in additional hardware. When we end up doing a hardware refresh, we have to buy fewer servers. It also gives us the benefit of ease of management, because when we look at our virtual machines now, we're not as concerned about the underlying hardware layer, we can manage our virtual machines as that virtual machine layer. The flexibility is also a huge benefit when moving to compute virtualization, because you're never going to have your users basically come to you and say, I want my VM to run on host 2. You know, that concept's kind of gone by now, because the idea is the end user should never know or care really which host their virtual machine is running on. As long as they're presented the service, as long as they have the service and the applications they're accessing on a daily basis is running well, then they're happy, you know, and happy users is happy everybody. Right? And touching a little more on the ease of management, because we're dealing with that higher layer, dealing with that virtual machine layer, we're able to introduce some resiliency in the environment. We're able to use some features such as VMware's high availability to insulate us from virtual machine failures or actual hardware failures in our environment. Also able to use technologies such as fault tolerance, so that with that, if a host were to fail, we keep our virtual machines up and running, right, even in the event of a hardware failure on the back end, because we're able to perform this management at the virtual machine layer above. Another thing that compute virtualization does for us is that it's step one of our move to a software-defined data center. And what is a software-defined data center? Well, as I mentioned in the intro, this is something that is constantly changing, that is constantly moving, kind of a moving target, but it was designed to be that way. It's kind of an evolving concept, right? Now, moving forward, the idea is, where are the physical resources located, right? This goes back to that concept of the user saying, I want my VM running on host 2. Well, it's not going to happen, because the user doesn't necessarily care. As long as they're getting the service that they want, as long as they're able to do the job that they're supposed to perform, they're happy with IT and everything's good. Another concept is, how can we separate resources from management capabilities, right? So moving forward, we've got this idea that I've got my physical resources located in Raleigh, North Carolina. Say I have a data center set up here, and all my physical hardware lives there, right? What I can do now is separate out this hardware, even if it's all on the same rack, even if it's all interconnected. I can separate this out using this software-defined data center, using this data center object in vSphere. I'm able to separate these resources and manage these resources independently of each other. So within the same rack, I can have services going out to New Orleans, going to Washington, D.C., going to Houston, and I can manage them all as such. Right? Now, previously, we dealt with just dealing with this at the compute virtualization layer. Now we're going to be throwing in a couple more things to kind of empower the software-defined data center. So in addition to compute virtualization, the other thing that we're going to be virtualizing, or the other things, we're going to be looking at virtualizing our networking and virtualizing our storage. Right? So once all of this occurs, once we have networking virtualized and storage virtualized in addition to our compute, all of these things operate at a layer above where they physically exist. And that's going to give us a lot of flexibility. That's going to give us a lot of power to move things around, and also to ensure that we get consistent behavior and performance in each area, in each software-defined data center that we create. So what does a software-defined data center do for us? Well, one of the big things, and we'll talk about it a little more with vCloud Automation Center, is automation, right? Anything that we can automate, that's saving time from those menial tasks, or sometimes they feel like menial tasks to us as administrators, but anything we can automate ends up freeing up our time for something else, right? Other projects. It also enables us to implement self-service for our users, and we'll talk about that in a bit as well. Also, when we create this software-defined data center, since we're operating at this layer above where our physical hardware exists, scaling up or scaling down becomes somewhat of a trivial matter. We add more resources to the back end, or we remove resources that aren't needed, but we still have that software-defined data center operating at that layer above. Another plus for the software-defined data center is that it's going to be cloud ready, right? And I know some of you may be sick of hearing cloud in every single commercial break, anytime you're trying to get away from IT for a bit, watch TV or something like that. But the concept here, it's here to stay, and there's some very powerful things we can do with cloud technology, looking at either public cloud solutions, private clouds for within our organization, or hybrid, being a mix of the two. The other thing the software-defined data center is going to do for us is, because we're operating at that layer above again, it's going to insulate us from any problems we have at those lower layers. Just like with host or compute virtualization, our VMs being insulated from a hardware failure at the host level, we're doing the same thing with an entire data center, right? And that gives us the ability to implement features that give us zero downtime, right? And if you go to your CIO right now, or if you are the CIO right now, you look at the idea of zero downtime, that's a pretty good solution, right? And most zero downtime solutions end up costing way more than you could possibly budget. This is an avenue worthy of exploration. The other thing we get with a software-defined data center is we get standardization. We have multi-site environments, such as my example with New Orleans, Houston, and Washington, D.C. Having all of those resources virtualized, we can make sure that everything is laid out exactly the same across our entire organization, be it in one physical location or multiple physical locations. So we need to not only discuss virtualizing networking, but also virtualizing our storage. But right now we're going to focus on that network virtualization. So how do we accomplish this? Well, we take our physical network, just like we did with our physical hardware, and we're adding a layer above it, dealing with a virtual network. Right, now some of you that have already been around virtualization for a while might say, John, we've already had virtual networks, right? We deal with these on our hypervisors on a daily basis, right? We have to design these distributed virtual switches or standard vSwitches or whatnot. And really the answer to this is yes and no. We are leveraging that idea of networking existing on the hypervisor, but what we had before was kind of a solution of networking at each hypervisor layer. What we're looking at doing now is taking this to the next level in virtualizing entire networks. So what does this mean for us? Well, if we take a look at our levels again, our layers, we have our networking hardware that already exists. Now this might be Cisco hardware, this might be Juniper hardware, it might be Enterasys hardware, it doesn't matter. The concept is these are the physical devices. This is where we have to go make sure we have the power available. This is where we have to do all of our cabling. This is where we have to ensure that all this is racked properly and whatnot and interconnected as it's supposed to be. Right? That takes a lot of time. In addition to that, we have our hardware configuration. This is where we're configuring our security settings, any kind of enterprise policy settings we have, port security or specific VLAN settings, private VLANs or whatever you may have configured in your environment. And just taking these two layers, these are kind of the time sinks, right? If we have something that we need to roll out or something we need to deploy, previously we had to rely on these two steps first in order to grow, in order to expand. So what that resulted in was users coming to IT saying, look, I need X, Y, and Z done. So we would go to the drawing board, figure out how we could design this network first of all. Then we have to see if we have the resources available, if we have the capacity available, sometimes if we have the licensing available and all that sort of thing. Then, after those few meetings, we have to have additional meetings dealing with implementation of this new scaled out network, right? And that could include downtime, it could include reconfiguration or adding new hardware, so more budget issues come into play and things like that. Well, what we're doing now is operating at a layer above this physical layer and this configuration layer, and that's adding in the virtual networking, right? So what that's going to do is it's going to utilize the existing hardware that's already set up, utilize the existing configuration that's already set up, and really you still have to do the design of the networks, but that's pretty much it. When you do this design, you're figuring out, you know, which traffic is allowed to which areas. We're building firewalls and things like that. We're doing all this at a virtual layer above where this physical networking exists. And the product that we have for this is VMware NSX. Now, some of the selling points or the big key points of VMware NSX, it works with any hypervisor. So a lot of people, when they started looking at network virtualization, if they have even explored it yet, thought, you know, it's a pretty big decision, and if I get something, I'm going to be locked in, right? Not necessarily the case with VMware NSX, because it does have the flexibility to work with any hypervisor, works with any network hardware, works with any cloud management platform. So no matter what stage you are in your business and in your IT development, you can still start considering implementing VMware NSX. The provisioning is greatly simplified. Basically, if you're a network admin, you're going to love this, because the things that you enjoy doing, the design and that sort of thing, that is exactly how you implement these virtual networks, right? You're not having to go in and make all these config changes on specific ports and things like that. We're doing it at a higher level, at a design layer. Some of the other things we talk about, standardization. So the idea is, if I create a virtual network in one location and I have multiple sites, I can just bring that virtual network with me to other sites and share it out, right? So that gives me standardization, and I don't have to deal with the management of the physical network underneath and all the IP translation that I would have to do to move from my New Orleans data center over to my Houston data center, right? They're going to have different public IPs and different routers and all this stuff. I'm not as worried about that with my virtual network. I can just bring it over, right? It's going to go ahead, because it's operating at that higher level, it's going to utilize the resources underneath it. This also gives us implementation speeds of going from weeks to seconds. So rather than having to roll out new switches or buy new switches, have them shipped in, configure them, make sure the firmware is updated, put in all our policies and whatnot, and branding and passwords and security and all this stuff, we just roll out that basic design of the virtual network, and there it is. It's up and running, right? So the end result is when our users come to us and say, you know, I need this networking set up for my new project or whatnot, we can have that done before lunch, you know. And we also can control this the same way that we can control our virtual machines, the same way we can already control our virtual infrastructure, using policies, using rules, having everything set up in place so that we make sure we don't unintentionally violate some security settings or something like that we have in our environment, so we can keep it protected and roll out things in a safe way. So another thing I'd like to mention is who's using this. We have some pretty big name players down here already implementing this technology, you know, AT&T, Rackspace, eBay, PayPal, and more, right? And this is constantly growing as well. So I encourage, if you want some more information on network virtualization, we have our official VMware network virtualization blog, which is blogs.vmware/network virtualization. And then we actually have signups additionally for VMware NSX webinars. It's a webinar series that VMware has been doing where they do a live presentation with, I believe, demos and whatnot. So if you're looking to get more into network virtualization, some good links for that. So another component of our software-defined data center, we've covered the compute virtualization and the network virtualization briefly. Now let's talk about our storage virtualization. So dealing with our physical storage, if you've noticed the pattern by now, you can probably already guess what's going to happen. That's right, we're adding another layer. So on top of our physical storage exists virtual storage. By doing all of our work at this layer above where the physical storage exists, we're able to get some of those benefits again, right? And the product that's going to bring that to us is VMware Virtual SAN. So VMware Virtual SAN is built from the ground up to be designed specifically for our virtual machines, right? This isn't a storage product that's going to be sharing out like NFS shares or iSCSI shares. What we're building here are data stores, and data stores are built specifically for our virtual machines. Some of the key features, we have non-disruptive scalability, which means as we require more space, if we have more drives available in our environment, we can add more space as needed, right? Without powering down different things, without causing a ruckus in our environment. Another very interesting thing about VMware Virtual SAN, hardware agnostic, right? As long as you're, basically as long as you're on the compatibility list for ESXi to recognize your hard drive, you're good to go for adding that drive in to a virtual SAN. The management for the virtual SAN is done all through the web client. So if you're familiar with being a VMware admin or you have VMware admins, They're familiar with the web client by now, hopefully, because that's what we're moving toward. And we can also integrate this technology with Horizon View for virtual desktop implementation and Site Recovery Manager, using that for disaster recovery as well. So an example of a virtual SAN, we see here a virtual SAN cluster that we've built out. And this exists across 3 different hosts in our environment. It exists on ESXi01, ESXi02, and ESXi03. On each of these hosts, we have a solid-state disk, or solid-state drive. This SSD is going to be our read-write cache. Because we're using this SSD for read-write cache, we're going to have really fast performance. And you can see we're able to pick and choose different drives to add in to our virtual SAN cluster. Let's say certain hosts have more physical drives connected to them than others. That's fine. But because we're operating at this layer above, I'll try the pin tool one more time and see if it's going to... Yeah, I'm getting no love from the pin tool here. I believe it might be showing up on your side, but I'm having some bugs over here. Anyhow, because we're operating at that layer above, that virtual SAN cluster layer, we're using that to insulate ourselves from failures at any of these stages, right? If ESXi02 were to go down, we have mirroring of the read-write cache on the other SSDs. We also have replication of that drive to other places in the environment. So virtual SAN is going to be automatically dealing with this in our environment in order to keep this data store up and presented to us. So what does virtual SAN do for me? Well, reduce total cost of ownership is a pretty big thing. And another implementation of virtual SAN is dealing with this low upfront cost. A lot of environments who are just getting into virtualization didn't really play around with the idea of shared storage or implementing a SAN into their environment. Well, this is kind of a good solution to get in there. If you have 3 hosts and you can attach some disks to those hosts, you're good to go with a virtual SAN, and you can scale this up, grow as you go, the term we use for that. And instead of buying into a specific system and having to deal with a certain SAN vendor, well, now we can just throw in some relatively inexpensive server disks, and we use the vSphere networking that's already in place, that's already on our host, and that's going to be delivering us a SAN-like experience in shared storage. So that's going to open up a lot for our virtual environment if we didn't previously have shared storage. For instance, being able to do high availability operations, fault tolerance operations, automation of vMotion through use of DRS. So that's going to be very powerful for us. If we, like I said, if we didn't have shared storage, virtual SAN brings us up to that level of having shared storage. As far as management for it, we're using the web client, like I said before. And really implementation of this is just you cluster the hosts that have the disks on them, and you tag a VM kernel port for vSAN traffic. And because we have that spread out through different hosts, that gives us protection from a specific host failure or network failure or disk failure. Like I said, because we're dealing with a distributed RAID at that point. Another interesting thing about virtual SAN is it has self-tuning storage and utilizes DRS for load balancing as well. So if one disk starts to get overloaded, we might migrate that over to another host, right? If one host starts to get a bit taxed on CPU resources or memory resources, we might migrate those virtual machines over to some other location, right? So vSphere is already going to be aware that a virtual SAN exists in your environment, right? The other great thing is because we've, at this point with virtual SAN, virtualized our storage, that's kind of our last component that we needed to integrate into our software-defined data center. So at this point, we've got our compute is done, and hopefully it's been done for a while. We've implemented our network virtualization and also our storage virtualization. All right, so for a little more on virtual SAN, and to sign up for the beta, if you want to try this out in your environment, we have the official VMware Virtual SAN beta site, which is vmware.com/product/virtual-SAN. I also have a link here to the data sheet. In the data sheet, there's a link to that actually from the Virtual SAN beta site. And that's going to give you more information about Virtual SAN and the features, kind of more of a deep dive of it. So moving forward, if we've gotten to this point where, even if we haven't gotten to this point yet, we already see this cycle. And this cycle is that as we increase the business demands, right, and the business demands are always, to grow and better serve customers and basically be better at what we do as a business, that ends up putting pressure on application demands, right? So dealing with IT, whether it's whether we're a developer and we're providing applications out, or just if we use applications on a day-to-day basis, we still have demands on that. So those demands end up putting pressure on IT operations, right? And those demands might be, I need more space, this needs to run faster, I need this to, I have a big project coming up, I need a test dev environment, things like that. And as these IT operations demands come out, that rolls back into business demands. Basically, as we solve those problems in IT, it comes back around and into, okay, thanks for doing that, but can you do it faster? And this is kind of the never-ending cycle of dealing with IT. We want it to be faster. We want to solve the needs of our customers and our users. So what do we need from IT operations? Well, IT needs to be more flexible, right? If a user's asking for a service these days, it's not necessarily always just something relatively simple, right? We don't have users that just ask for email addresses anymore. Right? Users and business demands, we end up needing complex multi-tier services. So we might have developers in our environment that need, a service rolled out in their environment that consists of 8 to 10 virtual machines with its own virtual networking kind of packaged together. Right? So we have to figure out where these resources are, if we have enough of them, can we even do this? There's a lot in the background now, but from the user's perspective, from what they see, is just, I put in a support ticket, why isn't this done yet? Right? So IT needs to have faster turnaround time on requests. It's that never-ending IT dilemma. Can we do this faster? Even if we meet that SLA, can we lower that SLA? Right? Ideally, we want to be infrastructure, and we want to handle those things behind the scenes. We don't want to be kind of the hold-up in that particular flowchart of getting this job done. So you have to answer the question, what is slowing down these processes? Is it maybe somebody signing off on something? Or is it figuring out if we have capacity? Or is it policy driven or something like that? Well, how can we keep up with these demands? One of the big ways moving forward is the concept of self-service. So if our users need a certain service delivered to them, why not give them a portal where they can just go in, just like they do on their smartphones at home and now on tablets and whatnot. Our users have gotten accustomed to this idea of an app store type experience where I want this, I tap it, I buy it, whatever, I download it, it's there. So why not leverage that idea and bring it into IT? So this idea of an app store type experience, how can we implement this? And how can we deal with self-service in an IT operations environment? Well, vCloud Automation Center. Now, the first thing you might go to, if you're like me, you might think of self-service. My concept of self-service was maybe a few years back, thinking about, okay, well, these are my power users in my environment. These are the people I trust. I give them admin rights, that sort of thing. We don't necessarily want to do that anymore, right? Because as our IT environments become more and more complex, the admin rights become more and more powerful, and we really don't want our users to go in there and accidentally goof up something in our environment. So when I talk about self-service, if the hair on the back of your neck stands up, like mine, just calm down a little bit, because we can control the amount of self-service that we give to these users. And we do that with the policy-based governance engine that's in vCloud Automation Center. And what this is going to allow us to do is ensure that, you know, user A can only deploy this particular service once a month, or they have a quota on how much space they can use, how much CPU or how much disk resource they can use, right? Using this self-service, we can deliver infrastructure services, we can deliver application services, or even custom services. And we can make sure that the same experience is delivered every time in any location. This could be in our New Orleans data center or our New Orleans software-defined data center, or in Houston, or whatever. And we control this with application blueprints. And I encourage you to follow some of the links I'll share later on vCloud Automation Center to get a better diagram of how this works. My simplistic drawing doesn't quite do it justice, but it conveys kind of the idea that service A is a combination of a web virtual machine and a database virtual machine. What I'm not showing here would be networking, tying those two together. But the end result would be that our user is getting service A each time they request service A be delivered. So rather than deal with service times being user submits a ticket has to be, first step with IT is always to get to the ticket, right? You may have other fires that you're constantly putting out, and then you bump into this person in the hallway, and it's kind of an awkward situation because they know that they submitted a ticket and you don't even know that yet, and you're kind of ambushed. We don't have to deal with that kind of thing, right? Moving towards self-service, our users can take these simple requests, now simple requests of provisioning services, and they can handle that themselves. So what happens is the service delivery times end up going from weeks down to minutes, because we take out a lot of the human interaction steps that we're kind of just going through the motions anyway of provisioning all this, and we put it kind of into the hands of the users and into the hands of our environment. So will VCAC work if I have maybe a different virtualization platform or a different hardware or cloud provider? Well, it's built from the ground up to be a multi-vendor, multi-cloud infrastructure. So the idea here is that if we have different physical hardware vendors, if we have different virtualization platforms and different cloud platforms that we're dealing with, it doesn't matter. That's exactly what vCloud Automation Center is built to do. It's built to handle all these different solutions and combine them into one unified solution so that what we're giving to our end users is exactly what they want. The bare bones simple, I want this service, okay, you get it. You know, our users don't have to be concerned about what exists kind of on the left side of this diagram here. What they want is the solution, which is on the right side. So to get to that, we have vCloud Automation Center. And one of the other interesting features in vCloud Automation Center is taking that key word of automation, we can bring this to IT and all of the other things that we have to do on a daily basis. So the VCAC Advanced Service Designer, this basically gives us a wizard, and with this wizard we can deliver quote-unquote anything as a service. And some examples that we have of this is new employee onboarding or email setup or backup recovery. Basically anything that we can develop a workflow for, we can package into a service and deliver that service out to our self-service portal. Right, so if we need email setup or something like that, we can create ideally a self-service portal for our help desk so that when a new employee comes on board, we have vCenter Orchestrator workflow already generated to perform all these tasks in our environment, and we bundle it up into a service and we're automating that. So we've talked a lot about what that does for our users and how we're helping the users out, because really helping the users helps relieve the stress of IT somewhat. But also, what else is in it for IT operations? Well, the big thing is with this automation of these kind of tedious tasks that we would perform and dealing with running around, checking all these policies and whatnot, if that's all automated, our plates are cleared for other projects, other demands, and putting out those other fires that we have in our environment. So that's a huge benefit for us. In addition to that, we have integrated chargeback throughout the product. If you're not quite familiar with chargeback, this is the idea that as a resource is used, we're placing a value upon it. Right? And chargeback is keeping track of all those resources and how much it was used. So what does that give us? That lets us see kind of at the end of the month or fiscal year or whatever it may be, kind of what was budgeted and what was used. Well, if you have an internal budgeting system where, say, engineering chips in a certain percentage of the budget and finance chips in a certain percent of the budget, well, we can see how those numbers are reflected versus what they're using, right? And if we're getting a lot more from finance, from use, than we are from budget, we can bring that to the table in our next meeting and say, look, you know, you're really taxing the resources here, but you're not chipping in enough. The other thing we can do is, if we don't want to be confrontational, we can adjust that on our back end and kind of control the services that they have access to or the resources that they have access to. And the other interesting thing we can do with this integrated chargeback idea is we can compare the cost of keeping these services on site versus the cost of moving them into the cloud. Right? So we have up-to-date pricing information and for cloud service providers and also for your power demands and whatnot on site. So the other nice thing about vCloud Automation Center, we're future prepping a bit, and what I mean by that is as we're building up this infrastructure at this cloud layer, we're ready to move it elsewhere because it is this flexible entity now. It's not tied down to one specific hardware vendor or whatnot. And lastly, we've got happy users equals happy everyone, right? If you don't have people giving you grumpy mumbling in the morning when you're walking into the office because they're like, oh, there's IT, why isn't my stuff done? Then your day's that much better, which is always a positive. So for more information on vCloud Automation Center and kind of some of the product walkthroughs and whatnot, we have the official VMware vCloud Automation Center site, as you can see there. And I included also the official VMware vCloud or Cloud Management blog, which this covers a lot of kind of the day-to-day problems we're seeing, or a lot of the use case problems that we're seeing of customers of VMware's moving certain services into the cloud, and how do they deal with this transition and whatnot. Some very interesting articles there. And lastly, what I want to share here is the Learning Paths website, which is VMwareLearningPaths.com. You can find links to that actually on VMware.com/education. But the concept here is that moving forward, if you want to find out more about some of this information, VMwareLearningPaths.com will allow you to kind of build a path based on what you want to know more about and what your role will be, if you're going to be in a management role, if you're going to be an administrator or whatnot. And using this path, it will guide you through some of the free and also cost-based training that we offer. And you can tie those directly into New Horizons and get in touch with your sales rep and let them know, hey, I'm looking to go this path of a vCloud administrator, so I'm interested in the vSphere Install, Configure, Manage course and whatnot. You can see one of the things I point out is that vSphere Install, Configure, Manage is kind of the foundation, right? With that class, everything else above this builds on that particular class, right? So we reuse a lot of those concepts, and we expect that level of knowledge in the later classes, or the higher tier classes. And as far as the NSX training, I put an asterisk next to that because there is not yet anything officially announced, but there are the webinars that I linked to. And the other thing, as I mentioned, VMwareLearningPaths.com does give links to free training for virtualization fundamentals and things like that that's already available. You just click to sign up for it, and you get to walk through that. All right, so with that, that is the end of the lecture portion. If we have any Q&A, any questions I can answer. Right, if not, thank you all very much for coming. Very much appreciated.